podcast. On several occasions during this Great to Good series, I've sort of found us spending time in the story in Genesis 1 and what is ultimately the origin story of the Bible. And this is because the origin story roots us in God's desire that the world and humanity be good. That our priority would always be to do what is good, to pursue the good, and to prioritize this as the human project. Like being good is what it is to be fully human. It's at the roots of what it is to flourish as humans. Now, the origin story of Genesis is trying to navigate a series of ideas and notions that are formative for the human experience, for us as humans. So, if you think about it, in Genesis 1 and 2, we get the purpose and order of creation. We see the roots of what it is that God dreams for the world. And then in Genesis 3, we're introduced to the human tendency to prioritize ourselves and our ego. Whenever humans seem to make intentional decisions, what happens is they end up living out of sync with the good creation. And this is what we encounter in Genesis 3. It's often known as the fall. But essentially, it's humans setting themselves up out of sync with what God has made as good. And now, this lack of harmony with the good is then going to shape the rest of the story, not just the story of Genesis, but actually the rest of the biblical story, the rest of humanity's story. Both our inability to live out the good and God's desire to resync the creation into goodness. So that's Genesis 1, 2, and 3. So it brings us to Genesis 4. Now, the first story of the Bible, beyond the creation and subsequent brokenness of creation, is the story of two brothers, Cain, a farmer, and Abel, a shepherd. And the story in Genesis 4 picks up on a moment where they bring offerings to God. So I want to read to you from Genesis chapter 4 and verse 3. It says this: "In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. And then the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it.'" Now, this is a dense little story that isn't entirely clear for any of us as readers. And despite many people attempting to explain why, it's actually not clear from the story why Abel's offering is better than Cain's. And any attempts to explain why one is better than the other generally involve making things up. So let's not do that. What the text does give us is simply this idea that for reasons unknown to us, Cain's offering wasn't, the translation I was reading said, right. But interestingly, the Hebrew word that is translated right is the word yatov, literally good. Something wasn't good about Cain's offering. And Cain is upset that his offering isn't good. And God says to him, and the original Hebrew is really quite poetic and visual here. God essentially says, "Why be angry and have a downcast face? Do what is good and be lifted up." And then there's a warning. If you don't do good, sin, this force or presence that has unsynced humanity and creation from God's goodness, it's crouching at the door. Like God presents Cain with options and consequences. Choose a path of goodness, which will elevate you and sync you with the way you're created, or continue down the path of further brokenness. So you know how this story ends, right? Well, let's pick it back up again in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 8. It says this, "Now Cain said to his brother Abel, 'Let's go out to the field.' While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. And then the Lord said to Cain, 'Where is your brother Abel?' 'I don't know,' he replied. 'Am I my brother's keeper?'" You knew how the story was going to end, didn't you? Now, is it because you know this story? Or is it because you know this story? Like, it's one thing to know the story of Cain and Abel, but that's not really the point here. The point of this story is to know that this is the story that happens every day. Well, this is all of our stories. Whether it's with your siblings, or in school, or a sport team, or your workplace. Two people seeking a particular status, a particular honor, and the result is that we get conflict. Like this is our story. Instead of pursuing the good, we choose, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, but we choose the path of conflict. We choose the path that attempts to elevate ourselves at the expense of others. Humanity consistently and repeatedly chooses the quest for honor, not the quest for goodness. What do I mean, though, by the quest for honor? Well, at some level, what I mean is what we see Cain do. So studying honor is essentially to explore how we estimate our own worth and our own value in our own eyes and in the eyes of others. It's about how we see our public standing. And the ancient world was overtaken by the quest for honor. It was the one thing you were concerned about more than anything else. What's my status? What's my station? My position in society? How am I being perceived by others? But this comes with a cost. The great 3rd century philosopher Aristotle noted it like this. He said, "Men seem to pursue honor that they may believe themselves to be good." Now, notice that. What Aristotle doesn't say is that people attempt to be good and then get honored for it. Rather, he says that people try to be honored and this will allow them to think they are good. Like a 2,300-year-old philosopher may have just identified a huge problem with contemporary life and the human condition. Do we care more about status than goodness? Is great better than good? Now, you might say, well, yeah, but I don't care much about honor, and nobody else does these days. That's for the ancient world. But honor hides amongst us in different language nowadays. We talk about it in terms of pride, self-respect, reputation, status, prestige, dignity, saving face, or fame. Like, imagine if we were to reword Aristotle for the 21st century. Perhaps it would say something like, people seem to pursue fame that they may believe themselves to be good. Like, does having a lot of Instagram followers mean you're good? Do your views on YouTube equate to your worth? Now, what Aristotle notes seems to be still true, that we confuse goodness with the wrong things and behave accordingly. You see, Cain, in our Bible story today, he didn't do what was good. But rather than correct his own lack of goodness, what Cain does is he simply removes the competition. Him and Abel are not quite measuring up equally, so rather than pursuing goodness, he kills his brother. And I think this is what happens when we prioritize the quest for honor or competition for status. It generates conflict, not mutual respect and love. Do you remember Cain's question? Am I my brother's keeper? So competition for honor and status, even before God, it doesn't make us care for each other. It doesn't make us good. In the book, The Road to Character, the author David Brooks claims that this current cultural moment is a highly narcissistic one that he notices focuses around what he calls the big me. Like, Western culture is becoming highly individualistic and convinced that each of us are extraordinary. And psychologists, they use something called the narcissism test. And what they're noticing is that the median score in these tests has risen 30% in the last 2 decades. We're becoming more and more self-obsessed. The desire for fame is similarly growing. In one recent survey, over half of the young people reported being famous was one of their top personal goals. Do you remember Aristotle? If I'm famous, will that allow me to think that I'm good? So Brooks then identifies something that I think we should hold on to. He recognizes that our pursuit of personal significance or success, fame or honor, leads us to prioritize the development of what he calls resume virtues. Resume virtues are the skills and competencies that help us on the job market, that help us gain external success. Resume virtues are what the ancients would have called honor, the things that get us status and recognition, the skills and abilities and virtues that we will boast about to get ahead in the world. But Brooks also points us over to another set of virtues. He calls them eulogy virtues. What are eulogy virtues? Well, these are the things that people will talk about at your funeral. Were you kind? Were you honest, faithful, brave? Were you good? Eulogy virtues differentiate between being good at something and being good. And there's a big difference between being good and between being good at something. And while many of us know that the eulogy virtues matter and are important, a glance at our lives suggests that we spend more effort on our resume virtues. We spend more effort on the stuff which will give us honor and status. Google offers this feature called the Ngram. And the Ngram view basically measures the use of public language across time. The sort of published works of the world are there, and you can look at and see how language is being used and the volume of language being used. It basically allows us to see what we talk about. Perhaps unsurprisingly, language relating to self and success has risen steadily over the last 100 years, while language relating to kindness, sharing, and community has dropped significantly in our conversations. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, increasingly, the answer is a resounding no. So what does this mean for the person trying to follow the way of Jesus? We live in a culture saturated by the pursuit of honor, the desire for status that celebrates almost exclusively resume virtues over eulogy virtues. Well, Jesus is perhaps a prime model of someone who lived out eulogy values over resume values. Like, think about it. We talk about Jesus because of his sacrificial, other-focused death on a cross. But notice what Jesus said too. In Mark chapter 8, verse 34, Jesus turns to a crowd and he says to them, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." Like, he's showing a pattern to us, a way of rejecting the honor game, stepping away from the pursuit of fame or resume virtues. Jesus is inviting us into the path of goodness. And the early Christians, they saw this as a model for how they functionally shape and form the communities of Jesus' followers that gathered together. These groups that we now call the church. So when we get to Romans chapter 12, we find Paul shaping out his dream for the Christian community. But what we notice is that it's not a community shaped by the conflict and tension of Cain and Abel, but it's a community modeled after the call to deny yourself and take up your cross. Like if the quest for honor leads to conflict, notice how Paul advises his communities in a different way entirely. Let's look at Romans chapter 12, beginning at verse 9. Paul says this, "Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in family love." The word that Paul uses is literally Philadelphia. It means brotherly love, like the opposite of what we saw in Cain and Abel. Paul continues, "Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone." Again, interestingly, in the Greek, Paul says, be careful to do what is good in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And then in verse 21, Paul says, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." So, just for a moment, perhaps you have Romans 12 to look at. Think about how this text forms the antithesis of what we saw in Genesis 4 with Cain and Abel. The brokenness of humanity in that story is exemplified in a quest for honor, the abandonment of goodness, conflict with a brother, and then evil crouching at the door, ultimately overcoming Cain and bringing murder and brokenness, all of which is encapsulated in the phrase, "Am I my brother's keeper?" But here then in Romans 12, instead, Paul envisions the church as a place that clings to what is good. What a beautiful phrase, cling to what is good. The church is a place that does consider honor, but gives it to the other, gives it to someone else. The church should not participate in narcissistic evil, but rather do what is good. And as I said, it's interesting how so many English translations render this, "do what is right." But here's the thing. Life isn't always black and white. Sometimes it's not always going to be as simple as right or wrong. Sometimes what you need to do, sometimes what you're going to have to do, is be guided by what is good. See, Paul encourages us to live in peace and harmony, to avoid revenge. If you're persecuted, Paul says, bless your way out of it. But verses 9 and 10 deserve our attention. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in Philadelphia, family love, or brotherly love, some translations would say, and honor one another above yourself. Like, notice how Paul offers Philadelphia as the contrast to honor seeking. Like, resume shouldn't matter in a family. Resume values, the conflict that comes with that, the skills and values that put us in conflict with each other, they shouldn't be at play in a family setting. Am I my brother's keeper? Yes. Yes, you are, Paul says. See, the conversation between God and Cain in Genesis 4 opens us up to the reality that choosing to pursue status or greatness at the expense of being good is a destructive way of life for the individual and for the community, even the church community. Jim Collins famously said in his book, "Good is the enemy of great." But the narrative arc of the biblical story might be trying to tell us the opposite. It might be trying to tell us that great can be the enemy of good. That our pursuit of status is destructive to us personally and to our communities. The pursuit of greatness can sometimes leave evil crouching at the door. So, Paul says, we must cling to what is good. So what does it mean for us as Christians? What does it mean for us as churches, as church communities? And I think it invites us to be aware of the context we live in. God warns Cain that when you pursue status and honor, there's a destructive evil crouching at the door. So instead, choose to be good. One way that we choose to be good is to reject the things which encourage us to think about status. And let me be clear, prioritizing the good doesn't mean we don't care about how things are or how things look or how things sound. It just means that we're not prepared to sacrifice being good in the pursuit of those things. Like, is your pastor the best preacher? Is the music at your church the best worship? Like, well, listen, you don't want your pastor to be an awful teacher, and no one enjoys out of tune or out of time music. But the first and good question to ask should be, does my pastor teach what is true? Does our worship lead and point us to trust in Jesus? Those are good questions. So, are you a great person? Is our church the best church? Well, these are the wrong questions, because attempting to answer them will make us wonder if those are the qualities we should be pursuing. The theologian Stanley Hauerwas was credited by Time magazine some years back with the title, "America's Best Theologian." But when he was asked to comment on this, Hauerwas replied, "Best is not a theological category." Best is not a theological category. I don't think churches should get involved in the pursuit of best. We should be relentlessly committed to pursuing good. From Cain and Abel, through Aristotle and Paul, to David Brooks of the New York Times, there's an awareness that the pursuit of supremacy, the quest for best, will become toxic to us. Evil's crouching at the door, God says to Cain. Like, we will not care for each other well as a church community if we pursue best. Like, we will not be our brother's keeper if we quest for best. We will not take up our cross if we're constantly trying to be the best. So, may you follow Paul's advice and perhaps take it as your blessing today from Romans chapter 12, verse 9 and 10. May you hate what is evil. May you cling to what is good. May you be devoted to one another in Philadelphia. And may you honor one another above yourselves. And in doing so, may you take up your cross and follow Jesus in the way of goodness. Grace and peace.